Okay, good morning and welcome to this lecture number 5 on state and market, economics and politics and theories and ideologies. And you have 3 pieces of readings for today. It's first of all I'll start by speaking about this current context, the US, President Donald Trump, and you have an article, easy to read article by Irvin, who writes from an economic liberal perspective. Secondly, we have an article that deals with globalization and the geopolitical risks, what the authors term a word of guarded globalization, changed there. And thirdly, you have the book chapter by Robert Gilpin, which deals with ideologies or theories of economics within international relations. So I'll start with perhaps the easy contextual part, and I have a picture of Donald Trump here. And this article I've kept on the readings. It's from 2017, the beginning of the presidency of Donald Trump. The article was published in Foreign Affairs, which is kind of an essay type article that proposes an argument, and in this case it's an argument against protectionism, against economic nationalism, against the policies that Donald Trump promised to effectuate in his presidency. So Irvin is an economic liberal. It has to be said that some of these promises during the election campaign and some of these economic policies instituted by Donald Trump, favored by Donald Trump, they are really, they're not, extreme. And I'll get back to that because you'll see that when you read Gilpin, that some of these policies are fairly mainstream in a way, but they differ from the direction that the US and Western countries in particular have, the direction that their economic policies have taken for the last, for many decades now. But anyway, when Donald Trump, during the election campaign, he promised a lot of things, America first in economic terms and in many other, on many other issues. He promised economic nationalism, protectionism, even though he might not have used these exact terms, and he instituted a lot of policies, or promised that he would follow a lot of policies. So Irvin goes through some of this, like the withdrawal from the so-called TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and that included a lot of countries bordering the Pacific Ocean, really, essentially. So in South America, you have Mexico in Middle America, and you have some of these Asian countries, Singapore, South Korea, Japan. And this was supposed to be a free trade agreement that was in process during the presidency of Barack Obama. And Donald Trump promised that no, he would not enter into that partnership because it didn't serve U.S. interests, and the U.S. were taken advantage of, and etc. So the U.S. never entered into that. And there were a lot of other things other policy promises, NAFTA would be renegotiated. That's the North American Free Trade Agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico. That has been replaced. It has been renegotiated. There have been some tweaks and to that agreement. Basically, many of the things in that original agreement, have stayed the same. Trade warnings against allies, That's another thing. In particular against allies. Japan and South Korea have been, Donald Trump's message has been that these countries have taken advantage of us for a very long time. Europe as well. Previous presidents have agreed on things that harm the American worker, American economic interests. So Trump promised to renegotiate those agreements so that they fit his view of fairness and American prosperity better. You have other protectionist things, nationalist things, threats of special taxes on outward foreign direct investments, and all of these things contribute to changing how the market operates, because it's politics intervening really in economic processes, economic exchange. Then if we move to an issue that has a lot to do with great power politics as well, but even more, of course, about trade and investment across borders, the US has stepped up, and that was also promised by Trump, that they would screen and block inward foreign direct investment for national security reasons. And this has become quite common, and it has been practiced also in Europe and in a lot of other countries. Now one is more sensitive towards foreign businesses in sensitive sectors, in strategic sectors. High-tech sectors are the most common example, but you have natural resources, you have a lot of sectors, which another one of the pieces on the readings for today deals with. So the US has stepped up that for national security reasons. Steel production, for instance. Steel imports to the US or even car imports. Donald Trump has claimed that foreign control over these sectors will hamper national security. We need to be independent, sovereign in these sectors and on economic issues more broadly. Trade war with China, as we know, a huge issue, not settled, even though you have a temporary or preliminary agreement on certain stuff. High-tech industry battle, which has really heated up. And again, this, when you have these political ideas and preferences and you take them into economic issues and into trade exchange, economic exchange, then market forces don't operate freely and you skew the market, and politics is regarded as more important often than the market, which is kind of a fundamental thing for today. The battle between different perceptions of how the economy should be governed or not governed for that matter. And high-tech industry that's not anymore about free exchange across borders. Now there's a huge element of geopolitical risk, because it's about, from the American perspective, about who is controlling the most vital sectors of the economy in the future. High-tech sector. Because the country that controls the high-tech sector will also be in a position to be economically stronger than its competitors. So it's a power battle, at least partly. In general, as you are certainly aware of, Donald Trump, one of his most famous slogans is, of course, and the famous slogan is America First. We shouldn't think about economic exchange as, something that should be unrelated to domestic issues or to national security issues. We should always, according to Trump, think about how this trade deal, how this investment deal affect the American worker, America as a whole. So it's kind of, again, it's kind of putting national issues, domestic issues, non-economic issues really, sometimes non-globalization at the top of the agenda. And according to Irvin, Donald Trump consistently see trade as a zero-sum game, which also goes into the heart of some of these matters concerning, how the economy, domestic economy and international economy should be governed. When it comes to the international economy, it's often perceived, at least within the liberal paradigm, it's perceived as an arena where everybody can gain, and everybody will gain if they strive to specialize in the products that they're, that suit them best. If you're rich in natural resources, that's what you should produce, and you should get the other products that you need by exchanging natural resources for these things. Selling natural resources on the international market and importing all the other stuff you need. If you're technologically on top, if you have a highly skilled workforce, like in Norway, we have natural resources, but we also have a highly skilled workforce, then you should specialize in, says the theory, you should specialize in these, capital intensive, knowledge intensive industries. And you shouldn't, do labor intensive work. Workers in the Western world are highly paid, so in an international arena, it pays economically not for these countries not to produce. I think I earlier used the furniture industry example with respect to Norway. Plants are built in other countries where labor is cheaper. Donald Trump wanted to reverse some of these trends, get manufacturing back to the US. And gradually manufacturing companies have established plants abroad in Asia. Labor is cheaper, with the side effect that a lot of workers in the US have become unemployed. And these are the people or at least a major portion of the people who Donald Trump, tried to lure into his camp, and succeeded beautifully in that respect. But these manufacturing plants should be in the US. And we shouldn't specialize, we shouldn't follow, according to Trump, the globalization mantra that some sectors we can do, other types of product we get from Asia or from Europe or from Africa or Latin America. The theory behind that is this is economically efficient. If everybody specializes and you have free trade across borders, this is a smooth, theoretically speaking, smooth process, and everybody gains. You get what we call absolute gains for every economy, every national economy. The alternative perception is this zero-sum perception of international trade, that no, somebody always gain more than others. So it's really about trade is really a kind to international security issues, military issues. If others get strong and rich, that means that we lose, and vice versa. If we get strong and rich, others lose. So it's a different perception, and I'll get back to that when I talk about these economic ideologies theories. These are idealized versions of these phenomena. So if Irvin calls or says that Donald Trump, he thinks in terms of a zero-sum game, that there are losers and winners. We have to win in international trade and investment, and if China wins, we lose, and all that. There are nuances. So if we call Donald Trump, a zero-sum thinker, that's an idealized version of him, because there are nuances, and people normally don't go to these extremes, and Donald Trump doesn't do that either. But for analytical purposes, as the saying goes, it's useful to think. It might be useful to think in terms of Trump as a zero-sum thinker. Okay, the goal: better deals on trade. And then Irwin goes on, and he talks about how bad this way of thinking is, how bad it is if we, the Americans, that is to say, leave the globalization arena, leave the globalization thinking, leave the economic liberalist thinking. If we increase tariffs, you skew and you damage, the way the international economy operates, and we lose, and everybody loses. So that's his message, the free trade message. Free trade overall is good, says Irwin. And of course there are certainly, the theory behind free trade is certainly correct in many respects. Everybody needs to trade, that's one thing, because some large countries like the US, like China, in part like Russia, they can produce, they might seek to produce as much as possible within their own borders and limit international trade. It works to a certain degree for really big countries. For a country like Norway, it can't work. We're small, and we're totally dependent upon international trade for most of the products we use every day, for machines that produce other things, we don't have a car industry in Norway for very sound reasons. And if we don't have international trade, if we don't sell things to other countries, we can't import cars. So we have to sell fish or oil or high-tech products and stuff to finance the imports of necessary stuff. National economies overall tend to, at least most national economies tend to benefit from relatively free trade. Not necessarily zero tariffs, but if you have 200% tariffs on most goods, you will limit international trade to a great extent. So national economies and the international economy tend to overall to benefit from globalization, from relatively low tariffs. But there are a lot of exceptions within countries, and that's the wave, to put it like that Donald Trump has partly ridden in before he became president, and now as well, that there are a lot of losers from globalization. And the thinking behind globalization, economic liberalism, free trade is also that people and industries need to adjust. If you're outcompeted internationally, you have to find something else to do. That means businesses either go abroad or they go bust, and people are laid off. They have to adjust and find something new to do. And that's, kind of the social instability issue and the problematic issue. You create losers, you create people whose status is lost. So it's important to keep these things in mind, that even though relatively free trade and globalization is an efficient way, in theory, in principle, to run the international economy and international trade, there's a lot of issues that work in a negative direction. But Irwin, the free free trade theorist, he says that protectionism won't work, and he draws on some history lessons. And to be fair, many people draw on these history lessons. The 1930s, in particular, when it comes to international trade and coordination of the international political economy, it's often used as a sort of a scary example of a condition that we do not want to find ourselves in. So he refers to the Smoot-Hawley Act, the regulation or law, if we go back to 1930, a few months after the stock market crash in the US and all these problems that followed in its wake. The reaction from the US was almost immediately to when businesses ran into trouble. The reaction from the US was politicians was to try as best as one could to protect domestic businesses of various sorts and protect against international competition. So Smoot-Hawley was an act, piece of legislation that increased tariffs on a lot of products, which effectively meant that foreign producers who have gotten used to exporting certain things to the US, and the US was the biggest market at that time, it's still the biggest market worldwide, but it almost closed its borders, and that had huge effect on other economies around the world and on the international economy as a whole. So that was kind of the start of what turned into not only a global trade war, but also a currency war internationally. To state it briefly, if you lose market shares abroad, one solution can be to almost artificially lower the value of your currency so that your products become cheaper abroad. But when everybody does that, you lose your advantage and you get into a negative spiral that creates havoc and instability in the international financial system, and also when it comes to international trade. So you got a trade war, a currency war, you got a lack of coordination. It was everybody against everybody else to a large degree. So the British, they turned inwards, for instance. And by that I mean inwards in terms of the British Empire. They traded with low or no tariffs within their empire, and they had high tariffs against products coming from outside their empire. And the US had their tariffs, as I said, and other countries as well. Nazi Germany, when Hitler came to power in 1933, also had developed this regional economy centered on Berlin, but it didn't involve the whole world or large parts of the world, and you got these regional blocks around the world, and regional blocks dominated by these big powers. The French did the same, by the way, and the Soviet Union had their own problems and issues and revolution and after effects of the revolution. So we have different blocks. You did not have a globalization. You had little in terms of coordination between these blocks or between individual countries, between great powers. You didn't have economic institutions like you have today, the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or the G7, G20 institutions. So it was everybody against everybody else, and it totally damaged the international economy, and countries got poorer as a result. But for each individual country, it might have seemed, and it probably was, rational as long as they feared everybody else would raise their tariffs and devalue their currencies. Then it pays for your own country to do the same, even if the collective effect is terrible. So what's individually rational have a collective outcome that is irrational. And that's kind of a standard issue in many areas of society and the social sciences. Individual rationality does not necessarily mean collective rationality. And that's a big part of the reason why state leaders, states, big states, have emphasized after the Second World War, because the Second World War was really the end result of some of these processes. After the Second World War, in particular the US and its allies set out to devise a system that would hinder such effects as we saw in the 1930s. And international institutions, coordination of the international economy, those things were a key part of this, along with general liberal thinking. To avoid these tariff, national tariffs on every product, and to avoid the growth of regionalization or regional economies. And of course, after the Cold War, this thinking exploded, and thereafter we have this real globalization phenomenon with a vast increase in international trade, international investment, and overall, in general, a vast increase in economic growth, again at a general level. So Irwin, he warns against, this can trigger a global trade war. It will undermine liberal international institutions, the basis for our riches, the basis for international growth, the basis for international economic stability. So that's really the argument, that if the US follows these protectionist nationalist policies, the US is so big and powerful economically that other countries would have to adjust to the policies of the US, at least to a certain extent. And then again, you could end up in, the 1930s, a milder version, certainly. But the basic message is that what the US does have implications for what other will do, and then you can end up easily in a global trade war. That hasn't happened during the 3.5 years Donald Trump has been president. There's been a lot of issues and trouble and conflicts. It hasn't spilled over to, and we'll return to some of these things, I think, next time. The robustness of the system is probably a key part of the explanation. So we still have these international institutions, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, which is the key actor or organization, international organization in the field of international trade. International or World Trade Organization it started as a looser thing called the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, a few years after the Second World War. And the plan or the thinking was that we have to coordinate these things that have to do with tariffs. So we don't end up in an irrational spiral where every country tries to protect itself or its own producers by raising tariffs, because then you create an avalanche of tariff increases. So it has to be coordinated. You have to have rules, and this turned in a few decades later to a real organization, the World Trade Organization, that which is based on these meetings between countries and multilateral meetings where they agree roughly on trade rules and tariffs on certain categories of products, and it has worked because the organization and the countries within that, which is most countries in the world, they have managed, at least for a very long time, to coordinate these issues and to agree, and not least to agree not to go crazy, to put it like that, to not go crazy, but to increase tariffs out of for domestic reasons. It's not, they're not allowed to within that organization. So if you sign that international agreement, you promise to follow the so-called most favored nation approach. That's the basis, the basic concept underlining international trade, that if you institute tariffs, the tariffs you have, vis-a-vis an important trade partner, other countries cannot be given higher tariffs. So your most favored nation, the tariffs your most favored nation gets, everybody else should get. Now there are a couple of issues with the World Trade Organization, and it's difficult. It has to be said. It has been a success. There's no doubt about it. And it has underpinned a lot of this economic growth worldwide. But trade issues and cheating on trade it's a very complicated issue, because and we see that today, the accusations from the US that China, for instance, subsidize their vital companies, so they win out in an international competition. And it's not, they're not allowed to subsidize companies. But it's extremely difficult to establish whether or not a country has subsidized, given money effectively to some major company or important companies. If they do that, if they subsidize, you skew the competition. Other companies worldwide are outcompeted because that particular company in question, the subsidized company, gets free money. So they can increase their profits, they can sell, their products effectively for a loss, which is they're not allowed to, according to World Trade Organization rules as well. And then you have other stumbling blocks. Raising tariffs from 10% to 20%, tariffs is a tax on trade. That is obvious. And then other countries find out, the World Trade Organization finds out. But you can do other things. You can say that, no, we can't import, products from this and that country because they're not safe. They don't have the health standards or whatever that we have. And that's kind of a hidden tariff, non-tariff barriers. The major point is really that international trade is complicated, and cheating, so-called cheating on trade is sometimes not too complicated. And then you get into disagreements, and the World Trade Organization is also tasked with settling these disagreements. But the World Trade Organization arbitration and judicial system, to put it like that, doesn't work as right now, because there are some political tensions, and the US has really refused to appoint judges to that panel, so you have some sort of problems there. There are two other major issues right now with the World Trade Organization. One, which is not necessarily a current issue, because the only exception to the most favored nation principle, that everybody should be treated fairly and equally in terms of tariffs, the exception is regional trade agreements or bilateral trade agreements. So if Norway signs a free trade agreement with China free trade agreements don't have to be totally free trade in terms of zero tariffs, but relatively free trade. If we sign such an agreement with China covering a lot of products, and that has been an ambition for Norway, China can get lower tariffs. Norway can give China lower tariffs than other countries because it's legal within the international agreement that is a bilateral or regional trade deal. And you have a lot of these deals, and they kind of run counter to the multilateralism in the World Trade Organization. So some parts of international trade has become more regionalized, which means really less globalization with the emphasis on global. And that can be a major problem if you're an advocate for globalization, free trade worldwide. That can be a major problem if countries start, preferring trade with particular countries, not this multilateral worldwide thing, but particular countries. That can be a problem. A second problem, which has become really visible now, is an exception to the World Trade Organization rules that says that for reasons of national security, you may block out foreign companies. And that's kind of, a fuzzy concept, national security. What is that? So I briefly mentioned that the US and Donald Trump, he called the US car industry an industry that was sensitive in terms of national security. But you can almost say that about any industry. Food industry is of course, it has to do with national security, not in a military sense necessarily, but it's a survival issue. We need to eat. This was a big thing in the run-up to the elections in Norway, for instance, whether or not we should become a member of the EU back in the early 1990s and in the early 1970s as well. Should we have high tariffs against imports of agricultural products? And we do have that for various reasons. One of them is linked to national security. The same is true for European countries. So agriculture is often protected and it's certainly not only about national security issues, but that's one of them. Of course, military equipment, that's an obvious national security thing. Now, high-tech is a national security thing. 5G infrastructure, telecoms, things. Huawei, the Chinese company, is blocked now from several countries, allies to the US. They're blocked from the US itself because to let the Chinese steal or govern the critical infrastructure of these countries is seen as a national security issue. More and more such justifications are made, justifications for blocking out foreigners. And that's probably a weakness in the multilateral trade world. So a basic thing is that you have more protectionism now, and some of this trend, not all of it, some can easily be linked to the current administration in the US. But I emphasize some, because there are other trends, and one of the articles for today reviews some of these trends. Okay, unfortunately, most of what Trump has said to date suggests that he is interested in protectionism for protectionism's sake. He seems to view international trade as a zero-sum game, in which one country wins and another loses. Standard economic theory would say the opposite, that in international trade, we all win. It increases efficiency, it reduces costs, and it makes perfect sense to trade, multilaterally and also bilaterally. So one country wins, another loses, with a trade balance being the scorecard. And Donald Trump has been extremely preoccupied with the negative trade balance the US has with China. So China exports more to the US than the US exports to China. So most economists would say that, okay, that might not be that is really not a major problem. Because in a multilateral trade system, the US has a surplus with other countries. So it evens itself out overall. So it doesn't matter one bit whether or not the US has a negative trade balance or a positive trade balance with China. That's not the point. They have the US has a positive trade balance with a lot of other countries. But this is not a new way of thinking, and many politicians put a lot of emphasis, has in previous times as well, on the trade balance bilaterally. So if we lift our view and we don't focus only on the economic stuff, on international trade, and we can say that for security reasons, if you say that the US and China is engaged in a strategic competition, then it starts making more sense that, hey, we're losing out bilaterally in this trade. We have a negative trade balance. That means that China has some advantage over us. So this is kind of, to jump from the liberalism, that perspective, and until the economic nationalist perspective, where the concerns are different, and the tendency to view trade as a zero-sum game, along with strategic issues and military issues, that tendency is far bigger. Economic liberalism and adherence to the globalization paradigm, they tend to think that no, let the market solve this. Zero tariffs or very low tariffs. Let's trade, exchange products, and all of us win. And it doesn't matter that some countries, perhaps for a period, win more than others because they're more efficient, their companies are better temporarily. So economic liberalism says that, okay, there are absolute, gains to be made. Everybody wins. Economic nationalists would say, as Trump says that, or indicates that this is a zero-sum game. If the Chinese win, we lose. So we have to win, so they lose. And it's not necessarily a horrendously wrong way to view these things. There are differences of opinion and differences in terms of what are we concerned about, what are the Americans concerned about, or the Chinese concerned about. So one might say that Irvin has some good points. I think he exaggerates some of these points way too much, but that's a difference of opinion. So we will follow two simple rules: buy American and hire American, he said, in his inaugural address. But if every country adopted a similar pledge, international trade would shrivel up. That's the 1930s, the lessons from the 1930s. It's perfectly understandable that countries, for political reasons and for reasons of ideology, for reasons of, you want to attract voters, you say that, we should protect Americans, hire Americans. It's perfectly understandable. And it can be perfectly rational. I totally agree that if everybody thinks that way and, jumps into protectionism and high tariffs, then we'll have the 1930s sort of repeat. And collectively, it's irrational. So that's a standard, let's call it the prisoner's dilemma, for those who know the metaphor. Problem with cooperation in international relations. It makes sense often individually for an individual country to cheat, to not follow an agreement. to withdraw from an agreement. It makes sense. The trouble is collectively, because other countries reciprocate. If we cheat on trade, our partner will cheat equally. They will punish us. And then you get into this negative spiral, which is exactly the reason for the establishment of the World Trade Organization, to get out of this dilemma, this prisoner's dilemma, go out of this collective action problem. Very difficult, but the World Trade Organization has overall an impressive record on, considering the basis for comparison, which is often the 1930s. But these are interesting issues. So I'll take a short break and then I'll return to some more of these recent trends